Since people started lifting weights, there's been discussion and in many cases disagreement about what the best way to get big and jacked and strong is. We've seen percentage-based training, we've seen the Bulgarian method and starting strength and the West Side method, just to name a few, but there really is no one optimal way to train. The smartest lifters and the best coaches are going to look at this smattering of approaches as tools in a toolbox, and the more tools you have in your toolbox, the better equipped you are to deal with nuanced and complex and individual situations. Today I want to talk about one of my favorite tools and maybe one of the most misunderstood tools from said toolbox, and that is Rpe. First off, what is Rpe? Now, Rpe is used in strength training as an adaptation of something that used to be known as the Borg scale. Now, the Borg scale went from 6 to 20 and was used in the context of cardiovascular research. The reason the scale went from 6 to 20 was it correlated with heart rates between 60 and 200 to create an easy way to communicate how hard something was to researchers that could then try to draw some comparisons. But because, well, 6 to 20 is a pretty tough scale to actually judge anything on from a subjective point of view, it was changed to the modified Borg scale, which went from 1 to 10. Then along came Mike Teixeira, and he began to adapt the Rpe 1 to 10 scale to specifically powerlifting and more broadly strength and resistance training. Basically, Rpe attempts to define the performance of a set based on how many reps you had left in the tank when you were done. If you do a set and it feels like you could have done 2 more reps after you rack the bar, then that was an Rpe 8. If it feels like that was an absolute all-out max attempt grinder, that was an Rpe 10. We also use 0.5s in our Rpe ratings sometimes. For example, if you're not sure if you could have done 1 or 2 more, that would be an 8.5. Now you can use Rpe for any rep range, although it becomes difficult past about 10 to 15 reps. You can also use it for any exercise, although it's definitely easier to use with larger, more compound movements. Another note is that we don't really use anything below an Rpe 5. It can be really tough to tell if you could have done 7 or 8 more on that last set. So basically anything below an Rpe 5, we just call a warm-up. I think if you grabbed a really large set of the strongest lifters from the past 30 or 40 years, most of them would tell you that they trained by feel, at least to some extent. The thing is, training by feel and learning to sort of intuitively understand how much more or less to put on the bar, how many more reps, sets, whatever to do, it takes years of practice to understand how your body works in that way. The whole idea of Rpe is that it simplifies that process by creating a language that we can use to ascribe certain values to certain difficulties, and creates a commonality wherein lifters can be taught how to do this and can learn how to do this at an accelerated rate because of a common language. So by allowing people to discuss training, whether it's athlete to athlete or coach to athlete or athlete back to coach, it essentially creates a scenario like going into the Matrix and coming out knowing Kung Fu. I know Rpe.
Show me.
Even as a relatively new concept in strength training, Rpe has a fair bit of research to back its usage. A 2018 study by some of the biggest brains in strength and conditioning research, Dr. Eric Helms and Dr. Mike Zordos, investigated the efficacy of using Rpe as both a tool to estimate load and to make training judgments. This study found that Rpe was not only a valid way to estimate resistance training, but also a good way to gauge intensity near limit loads. The same study also found that Rpe-based training may even provide a small 1RM advantage to a majority of trainees. The long and short of it is that Rpe is a commonly accepted and utilized tool for both researchers and the best strength and powerlifting coaches out there, and has been studied enough that we can reliably say it works. At this point, it is likely the best tool that we have at our disposal when it comes to auto-regulation in training. And now you might be asking yourself, what the heck is autoregulation and why should I use it? Now, autoregulation is basically just doing more or less based on how your session is going. So you can do this by adding or removing load to the bar if you're performing really well. And I would gather or guess that a lot of people watching this video probably do this anyways. If you're having a really good day, you do a little bit more. If you're having a really bad day, you do a little bit less. These are the same kind of feedback and response systems that coaches will use to adjust athlete training protocols on a longer scheme just within a session. Now you may be asking yourself, is autoregulation good? Again, we can refer back to the data. One 2016 study found that a simple questionnaire better predicted and monitored athlete training response when compared to physiological and biochemical markers, which obviously can be much more objectively observed. Another study, this time from 2010, found that progressing load using autoregulation, as opposed to a classic linear progression model, resulted in bigger increases in 1RM bench, 1RM squat, as well as a 225 for reps test in Div 1 football players. In conclusion, not only is autoregulation a useful tool when compared to other modalities, but RPE is clearly a reliable method of applying autoregulation in a systematic fashion. Thank you for coming to my TED Talk. Basically, what we're driving at here is that in the long term, the idea behind RPE and autoregulation is that you learn how to adapt your training on the go based on how it's going. On a day that you go into the gym and you're performing well and the bar's moving fast and your technique feels good, you should be allowed to take advantage of that. And on days where it feels crappy and your technique feels off and the bar's moving poorly, you can do a little bit less. And overall, that's probably going to have a net positive impact. Now, the next big question is, how do I incorporate RPE into my training? And honestly, we could and we will make a whole other video on that and some of the intricacies of applying it to your training. But what we're going to do for now is we're going to leave you with some basics on sort of how to get your feet wet with RPE if you've never used it before. The first thing you want to do is just start tracking your RPEs. Every exercise, every set, when you put that bar back, just start thinking about, how did that set go? How many more reps could I have done? How am I performing? And try to tie that into one of the numbers as per the scale that we discussed earlier. 1 to 10. How many more reps could you have done? Now, realize that you're not going to be perfect at this when you start. You're probably going to overrate and underrate things, but that's okay. Rating your sets effectively is a skill. Using RPE well is a skill. Just like anything else, you're going to need to practice it to get good at it for it to have the biggest impact on your training. This step is simply to practice it. Take a few weeks or a month and just get used to rating things. Another great resource we came across while we were researching for this video was Rpe Calculator Com. It's a super easy tool. You can plug your training numbers into there and you can see things like your estimated max. And you can start to work backwards from that and begin to understand how we then use RPE and estimated max to inform training decisions, to identify trends in your overall progress. And these things can be really useful. We're going to talk a lot about these in the very near future, but to just begin to start to understand some of these concepts is a big step in the right direction. So make sure to stay tuned for the next video in this series when we talk about more advanced ways to incorporate RPE into your training, using it to modify your training, and even talk a little bit of programming and periodization theory in regards to its usage.